I ended the last video by saying that we were going to resolve things in this journey that we've been on for the past couple of weeks regarding just war and pacifism and where Christians should position themselves within that debate. However, in the past few days, I came across a couple of messages that I think really help to summarize exactly where we've reached on this journey so far and the conundrum that we're faced with as Christians. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to read both of those messages out. One's for just war, the other's for pacifism. And I think by putting these together, it really helps to bring a sense of clarity to exactly where we're at on this journey. As I said recently, I'm kind of working this out in real time along with you, so it's taking some unexpected twists and turns. I should also say though, before I get into this, that I don't want to labor the subject for too much longer because lots of exciting, positive things have been happening in the past week or so. You're probably aware of them while we've been on this topic. So I don't want to spend too much time on this when actually what's happening now may make this stuff completely irrelevant, or at least I hope it does. But if you'll bear with me, now we've started on this process, I just need to get to the end of this journey before moving on. So I've got 2 more videos planned for this topic. I'll try to finish with them this week, and then we'll get on to those exciting, more uplifting, positive topics. So anyway, the messages. The first one is a Reddit post that I came across last week arguing for just violence. And I couldn't believe as I read this just how well his independent thoughts had matched my own in that video a couple of weeks ago. He called his article The Paradox of Pacifism, How Violence or the Threat of It Enables Pacifist Wins. He said, I've been reflecting on pacifism lately and how, while it's often seen as a morally superior stance, there's a paradox lurking behind many of its most notable achievements. Here's the thing. Pacifism often relies on violence, or at least the threat of violence, to be effective. In many cases, the peace and rights that pacifists seek to promote and protect wouldn't exist without some form of force upholding them. Let's take the civil rights movement as an example. Figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for non-violent resistance, and their efforts were undeniably powerful and inspirational. But we have to remember that much of the movement's progress wasn't just because of peaceful protests. It was also backed by the threat of force. When peaceful protesters were met with violence, it was often the National Guard, federal troops, or law enforcement stepping in with the threat of force that ultimately ensured integration and desegregation. The peaceful marches and sit-ins were crucial, but without the government's willingness to deploy force against violent opposition, it's likely that change would have come much slower, if at all. So peaceful protesters were doing their thing with their marches and sit-ins, and that was great. It was inspirational. But when violent people attacked them, they still required the police force to fight at the edges to push those people back to create that space for their peaceful demonstrations. So in other words, the pacifism still relied on violence at the edges. Another poignant example is the Kindertransport during World War II. This heroic rescue mission saved thousands of Jewish children by transporting them from Nazi-controlled territories to safety in Britain. But let's be real. While it was a deeply humanitarian effort, its success was partly dependent on the British government's willingness to protect those lives using force. The children were being rescued from Nazi Germany, a regime that was expanding through violent conquest. And the only reason Kindertransport could work is that there was an implicit understanding that in time, Britain would fight back. Pacifism saved lives, but those lives were shielded by the violence that followed. So as the kids were taken to Britain from Nazi Germany and from around Europe, the army was creating space for those trains to arrive. And then once the kids had arrived in Britain, they were shielded on this island by the army fighting again at the edges. The peace of within was created by violence at the edges. It's that same thing we were looking at a couple of videos ago. This raises a larger point about the limits of absolute pacifism. Pacifism, when practiced in its most extreme form, absolute non-violence regardless of the situation, can sometimes be untenable, especially when faced with regimes or actors that don't play by those rules. The Nazis, for example, wouldn't have been swayed by protests or economic sanctions alone. In such cases, refusing to engage in violence or resist with force can allow atrocities to continue unchecked. The reality is that absolute pacifism only works if both parties come to the table in good faith, and history is full of examples where that simply doesn't happen. So we were just talking about this in respect of Islam. If Islam wanted peace, you could come with pacifism in good faith and it would work. But the truth is, it's hardwired within Islam and within the Quran to want conquest and domination and nothing less. It's right there in the Quran. They won't stop until all the world is under Sharia law. And therefore, atrocities under Islam just continued unchecked until they're met with resistance, which of course is what the Crusades did about 1,000 years ago. A more recent example is the grooming gangs in England. When the police became pacifistic, it just let the evil run wild. It became untenable. It just went unchecked. So there comes a time when you have to meet evil with physical force. Now, I'm not saying that pacifism doesn't have its place. It absolutely does. Nonviolent resistance can lead to profound social change. And the ideals behind pacifism, valuing human life, seeking peaceful resolution, are things we should all aspire to. But it's essential to acknowledge that pacifist victories are often won in the shadow of violence. Whether it's the enforcement of laws, the presence of military deterrence, or the knowledge that someone somewhere will eventually stand up to aggression with force. Many of the gains attributed to pacifism are underpinned by the threat or reality of violence. So this is that George Orwell quote again. Those who abjure violence can only do so because others are committing violence on their behalf. There has never been a successful, peaceful society in all of history that hasn't needed some form of force protecting the borders and enforcing the laws of the land. And therefore, pacifism, it seems, is a luxury belief where people can only commit to it if others are doing the violence for them. If the army and the police force stopped doing what they do, violence would then come to your front door and you wouldn't have the choice of being a pacifist. You would have to fight if you wanted to live. Now, this doesn't mean that we abandon pacifism altogether, but it does mean we need to recognize that it exists within a larger system where violence is sometimes necessary to create the conditions for peace. There are different gradients to pacifism, ranging from absolute non-violence to conditional pacifism, which acknowledges that force might sometimes be needed to stop greater harm. Most of us probably fall somewhere in between. At the end of the day, this paradox is something we need to wrestle with. Pacifism and non-violent ideals can help guide us towards more humane and just societies, but we can't ignore the uncomfortable truth that many of those peaceful outcomes have only been made possible by the presence of force. Would love to hear your thoughts. Does this paradox resonate with you? How do you reconcile the tension between pacifism and the role violence sometimes plays in enforcing or enabling it? So yeah, I love that post because it aligned with so many of the things that I'd concluded in the Just War video, just 2 videos back, that what we need is conditional pacifism. However, I received this email just a few days later, which I also thought was really good and well put, and it argues for the pacifist side. It says, "Good day, Brother Mark. Here's a humble thought regarding the last topic that you raised. I know this is not an easy subject, but I really believe we cannot neglect or worse reject Jesus' words regarding how to deal with our enemies. I believe those in power can use the sword to administer justice and maintain peace, but Christians must follow the path of their master. I know the Islamic threat is real and frightening, but the way of Christ is to bear witness even unto death. Put away your sword, Jesus told him. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Regarding the Crusades, you must already know that the majority of these men who carried the sword were far from being men full of the fruit of the Holy Spirit. Would Jesus have been part of the Crusades? But let us rejoice, because the day is coming when he will return and himself will establish justice on the earth. As I say, it's just a humble thought, and it's a good one as well. Because if the Bible truly teaches us your role is absolute pacifism, never to use violence under any circumstances, then we simply have to do it. Jesus is Lord and we have to trust. I'm reminded that all but one of Jesus' disciples were killed for their faith, and millions of others throughout history have been killed for their faith ever since. I'm also reminded that this conundrum is already facing many Christians in other parts of the world today. I don't know if you saw this, but when Syria had an Islamic revolution a few months ago last year, the Christians in Syria knew what was going to come to their front door. They knew what was going to happen. And so they went to their Christian authority, to the church, and basically said, when they come, which they inevitably will, can we fight back? Is this something that we're allowed to do.
سيدنا امبارح شيشاني حقه فرنك مصدي بسوق الغلا يحرق لنا شجره، نحن شجرتنا هاي كرامتنا، نحن ما لنا رجعانين، واشاره منكم ليك كلياتنا جنودكم ام نحرق الارض تبعهم، نحن كلنا جنودكم، نحن اولاد المسيح، نحن ما لنا اقليات.
ابونا في شغله كمان، صيدناها معرة معرونه، عاملين فيها اماره، ليش حاطين لهم واحد امير؟ شو هاي القصه؟ معلولة
عم ياخذوا البيوت العالم الصغيره يا سيدنا.
عندك يا شباب، هذا لازم يوصل صوتنا لهذا.
طلباتنا كلياتها واضحه، نحن يشيل الظلم عنا.
احنا معلولة هلا مهددين العالم، طالعينهم من بيوتهم، كل شوي يهددوا العالم، كل واحد بيلفوا له تهمه، بترجاكم نحط حد لهذا الشيء.
والاسلام كذلك الامر، طلعوا العالم من بيوتهم وقعدوا ببيوتهم.
If Islam establishes dominance in any Western nation, that scene will be replicated outside of churches in the West, guaranteed. And the question will be the exact same one. What are we allowed to do? Here's another Muslim in Canada promising that when they gain numerical advantage as they plan, they'll impose Sharia law on Canada and people won't be able to do a thing about it. Now, as it happens, I'm increasingly hopeful it won't come to any of this in the West and that a peaceful revolution, a revival of Christianity could already be underway in the West. And if that happens, the West can still be saved by peaceful means. I'm increasingly hopeful of that. But just in case, I do want to get some kind of resolution on this topic before we continue on to these next subjects. So again, that's what we'll hopefully do in the next video.